Well, this report should be out probably late January, early February, and I'll be sure to send it over to you all. We examined all 50 states as well as territories like Puerto Rico, Virgin Islands, Guam, to look and see who has actively funded OBF policies between 2017 and 2020. We found across 33 states, about 26 have a 4-year and 30 have a 2-year. And so why do we all, for those of us on this call, keep talking about outcomes-based funding, and why is it important in this conversation around racial equity and incentivizing student success? I think there's, I won't spend time capturing all of the data and literature on the limitations of OBF, but I will say it presents a unique opportunity. I've seen different folks begin to refer to, instead of performance-based funding or outcomes-based funding, student success funding. We are advocating and hoping to design equity-focused outcomes-based funding. So equity-focused funding that not only supports the enrollment of students of color, but the success of students of color. So that's exactly what we looked for. Identified 5 metrics: the enrollment of low-income students, the success of low-income students, the enrollment of students of color, the success of students of color, and something that we very rarely see, campus racial climate, because it's important not to just think about entry and exit, but also the experience in between, what's happening in those years that a student is enrolled in your institution, and how can both states, how can states use funding models and other policies to hold institutions accountable for that? So we looked through all of the policies that we found, and the most common metrics were the success of low-income students. And as Will said, a lot of the times when we're talking through equity, folks will say, well, we've got that covered. We incentivize the graduation rate of Pell-eligible students. But we know that that's not enough based on the data that we'll just talk through, and the things that we know to be true about the success, whether that's retention, transfer, graduation rates, all of those will be considered success metrics. We know that what is the reality for students of color and how things differ even when holding constant for race. So we know that metric alone is not enough to impact the enrollment or the success of students of color. 27 states are using those metrics for low-income students, and that would be transfer, retention, or certificate or degree completion. 19 states are using a success metric for students of color. Shouldn't be a surprise that enrollment metrics are the least common. Only 7 have an enrollment metric for students of color. And I think it goes without saying that this has to change if states are going to get serious about closing gaps in attainment among racial groups. Colorado, Rhode Island, and Wisconsin are the only states that have mandatory enrollment metrics for students of color, and even those are limited. So for example, Wisconsin's enrollment metric for students of color is mandatory for 4-year institutions, but optional for 2-year institutions. In Rhode Island, the enrollment of students of color is a metric for the University of Rhode Island, but not for Rhode Island College or the Community College of Rhode Island. So Colorado is actually the state that has a weighted or mandatory metric for the enrollment of students of color at 2-year institutions. And in the other states where we've found enrollment metrics, it is because it is optional or because the OBF policy allows the institutions to create their own metrics, like in Kansas. So I want to go through this slide briefly, and hopefully you all can see it. Happy to share it if not. So this is a table that outlines how each state with a race metric incentivizes institutions to focus on the success of students of color. And many states are using general descriptors like underrepresented minorities or non-majority, have seen non-white as well. Those states, I love that Will included the talking point and our discussion point around attainment goals. States that are looking at not only attainment goal, at all of their policies. So if I say I have an attainment goal that is disaggregated by race, and if I look at the current graduation and enrollment of students of color. If I am doing that through a lens of equity, I can then use a funding policy like OBF to incentivize an institution to close some of those gaps. So for example, Wisconsin's OBF policy for four-year institutions is unique because it explicitly names Southeast Asian students. In Montana, the OBF policy prioritizes American Indians, and in Hawaii, the state policy prioritizes Indigenous Hawaiian students. And I think just seeing how each state, the language for me is always interesting, but seeing the actual populations that they're addressing is also key to understanding data, understanding your state population and what needs to be true if you're going to reach attainment goals, but also have a populace that has the level of skills and education for the workforce in the state as well. So we talked through addressing campus climate. The metrics that we saw there and we're looking for might include student to faculty ratios in terms of the representation of faculty of color as compared to the diversity of the student enrollment. Campus climate and student engagement surveys are pretty popular amongst institutions, though not as a part of outcomes-based funding, faculty demographics. And then we saw some things outside of the box that dealt indirectly with racial equity, but for sure address campus climate. Like in Wisconsin, their technical college system actually rewards campuses for serving formerly incarcerated students. So only 4 states include some form of campus racial climate in their metrics. And again, only one of those, we want to emphasize the importance of equity metrics being mandatory, only one. So only Rhode Island's percentage of full-time faculty who are members of a minority group, only that one is the mandatory metric for campus racial climate. So it's a step in the right direction. I also think a lot of states track this information and track metrics like these as a part of, they might track the information, but they don't use it as a part of their OBF. So that's a step in the right direction, but if institutions are to be incentivized for focusing on a positive racial climate, it has to be connected to funding. So in addition to those on the slide, I mentioned Kansas earlier, uses performance agreements, which they design between the institution and the state and are unique. And some of the institutions in Kansas have chosen metrics that would incentivize campus climate. So really quickly, I want to talk through some of the information that we provided in our companion piece to the report, which is a deep dive in 3 states, Illinois, Ohio, and Tennessee, to just get a practical look at what's going on and what's possible for racial equity, but also how OBF has not served to advance it thus far in many instances. So we'll go through pretty quickly, but happy to go back during Q&A and discuss a bit more and re-show a couple slides. And so color-coded really briefly, here are the 5 metrics, and you'll see on each one, I've kind of pointed out what's there and what's not. They had a metric for success of low-income students, but no metrics around the enrollment or success of students of color. I think one thing that's really interesting and super important to point out is Illinois' OBF model is super tenuous, right? So allocations were made in 2013 and 14, didn't do it in 15 or 16. And the total funding has gradually decreased since OBF was adopted. And so when OBF is like such a small part of the institution's base funds, the policies can have little to no change. So even when there are metrics, I think Massachusetts is a great example of this, where they might hit all or most of the equity metrics that we're looking for, but it's only 1%, or in Illinois, it's 0.1% of the state's total allocations to community college. So it's a place that, so in 2019, half of the institutions received less than $10,000. 3 institutions only got $1,000 of OBF funding. So we know that's not enough to incentivize behavior. Just wanted to briefly show the gradual decline of Black students, increase in Latino students, but also a gradual decline in Pell students. I think even though this is a conversation on racial equity, community colleges have traditionally and historically been offered access. And so when we see declines in Pell students, we for sure want to dig a bit deeper and find out what's going on there. And we'll jump to Ohio. Ohio incentivizes, Ohio is the one of the three that we looked at that actually has a metric around race. They do success of students of color and success of Pell eligible students as well. We took a look at enrollment, and our colleague Drew has done some great work around like the representation of students of color in the state compared to the population in the state. So as of 2018, there were 5,600 fewer Black students pursuing undergraduate degrees at Ohio's public institutions than there were in 2012 when this policy was first enacted. And I think that speaks to when enrollment is not included alongside success, it isn't prioritized in the same ways it could possibly be. In terms of representation, in fall 2012, 6 of the 14 fourth-year institutions had a share of undergraduate Black students that was representative of the state's population. But by fall 2015, after multiple years of OBF, the state number that dropped to 2 institutions. So only 2 institutions had an enrollment, a reflective and representative share of Black students. And then briefly talking through 4 years at OBF, I just wanted to pull up and show, Will talks about increasing funds for HBCUs. OBF is absolutely a lever to do that and a mechanism to do that. And we see how, but all too often in my research and Tiffany's research, Dr. Jones's research, we see that it does the exact opposite. And instead of giving funding to incentivize student success, instead of giving funding to institutions that need it, it is doing a lot more of the same for sure. And so we went through, we're kind of looking at what was going on, looking at the OBF, and found that Central State was receiving far below the 4-year institution average per student funding of OBF, but also below similarly sized 2-year institutions. And so I think that definitely is an interesting point of conversation, but something that has to be pointed out to policymakers to say, look, what is the ask of 4-year institutions? What is the ask of 2-year institutions? What are the resources that are needed for students to be successful? And how are you using this policy to exacerbate some of those differences and some of the inequities? And how can you use it to solve it instead? Tennessee's 2-year only, Tennessee has both 2-year and 4-year. We'll take a look at the 2-year here. They're very similar policies. They do prioritize the success of low-income students, but no metrics for race. What we've seen in Tennessee's 2-year institutions since the implementation of OBF, but also we know they have a free college program. We know that they have many policies that are talking to each other and working hopefully in tandem. We know that according to the census data, Tennessee's Latino population increased from 4.5% in 2010 to 5.5% in 2018. And before 2015, none of the 2-year institutions had a representative share of Latino students. In 2015, Nashville State Community College became the first institution to have a representative share of Latino students. But by 2019, 6 of the institutions enrolled had a share of Latino students that was proportionate to or greater than the share of Latino residents in the state. So I think that's like a great point, and that's the things that we hope to see. So before we close out, I want to offer some practical implications for incorporating racial equity into OBF formulas. And we'll go through pretty quickly, but again, happy to dig back in during Q&A. So I want to make sure we have lots of time for that. Making equity metrics not only mandatory, but weighted is super important here. I think we pointed to examples in Illinois, pointed to examples in Ohio. Tennessee also has that quality assurance funding, which is optional and actually might be the only one that has all 5 of the metrics that we're looking for, but it's totally optional. Institutions don't have to participate in any metric that they don't want, essentially. They design their own. And so if you know that the success of your students of color, the enrollment of students of color is a weak point for your institution, you can decide that that's not what you want to use it for. And so we know that making equity metrics mandatory, but also providing that additional weight on the enrollment and success of students of color not only incentivizes institutions, but gives them the resources they need to provide the student success supports, whether that is advising, mentoring, coaching, wraparound services, whatever that is, it actually gives the institutions the funding to make those types of changes. Making sure that the metrics are both inclusive of low-income populations and explicitly around race. We went through and saw how different states were doing that. And then discouraging reducing access to high quality degrees for low-income students and students of color. This means two things. One, institutions that, in some of the data that we looked at, are increasing outcomes, but decreasing the enrollment of student success are not increasing access overall. So you can't, there's a lot of evidence of creaming when it comes to admissions decisions and outcomes-based funding. Institutions should be discouraged from doing that, whether that means placing thresholds around how much your population can drop, whether that means, I've seen some recommendations around like punitive financial damages, so taxing your OBF based on evidence that you are decreasing the enrollment of your students of color. I think that's the first thing we need. The second thing is that you cannot simply turn mandates to diversify your student population on their head for minority serving institutions. And we've seen that all too often where they say, well, HBCUs in Mississippi, if you want access to this funding, you need to decrease the diversity, you need to increase the enrollment of white students at your institution, because we know that that is not fostering equity for students of color and the students that those institutions have traditionally offered access to. Investing in student success, as we've discussed, incentivizing positive campus racial climate, avoiding instability and drastic funding cuts. I think this is super important as states grapple with the reduction in taxes and the number of dollars able to be allocated publicly. I think those cuts, if they have to happen with equity in mind. And it will be tough conversations for sure, but whatever progress has been made, removing the funding from that cripples institutions, particularly when we've seen drops in enrollment this year that for sure are related to COVID and students' just ability to be successful under this difficult time. I also want to point out, we know who's dying from it during this pandemic. We know who frontline workers are. We know who essential workers are. We know who's being exposed. And so whatever we can do to keep students in school and give them the resources they need, that's combating COVID, right? From a higher ed perspective. I think that's super important. And then investing a significant amount of funds in the OBF formula to actually incentivize behavior. And last, a few steps for implementation, diversifying state officers. It is always fun to me to go look at the SHIO office. It's always fun to me to look at the Board of Higher Ed, to look at the institutional boards and see no color and see more of the same. So this means diversifying in hiring, but also in appointments, because people always ask, so what can be done? Where are the OBF policies that have race included, and what's going on in those states? And I will always say, well, we had Dr. Zakiya Smith-Ellis in New Jersey and Dr. Kim Hunter-Reid in Louisiana. And so the presence of people in decision-making positions is incredibly important to be leading this work and centering racial equity for sure. Engaging institutions that serve low-income students and students of color in both the design and implementation. So all too often, HBCUs are left out of the conversation. Minority-serving institutions are left out of the conversation. Community colleges are left out of the conversation when it comes to either implementing or changing an OBF policy, investing capacity in under-resourced institutions, as we've discussed, providing technical assistance. This one is always fun. We had number 3, so we need to have number 4. So in as much as we're saying these institutions know how to educate students of color, give them the money. It's that simple for me most of the time. Like, they know what they're doing, give them the money. On the flip end, we know that there are institutions that have money but don't know what they're doing, or don't have the best results. And so we think it's important for states to provide technical assistance from folks like Ed Trust, from Dr. Sean Harper Center at USC, for people to have the expertise they need to be able to say, we understand we have a racial equity issue. What is it that we need to do? And so providing that as a part of implementing OBF and holding institutions harmless in those initial or transition years, by matching previous funding, and giving them some time to adjust, we think is always good for sure. So thank you all for letting me chat with y'all, and we are happy to take questions.
Very good. Thank you so much, Will and Kayla. A very informative and compelling presentation. I'm sure there are questions. Feel free to either place them in the chat to everyone, or to me privately, or to just raise your hand if you have a question now to get things started, and I'll do my best to call on folks. I'll start with. I didn't see him. I'll start with one that Professor Kane raised around the accreditation, and in the Hard Truths report, one of the recommendations there is that the accrediting agencies examine the college's racial climate as part of the larger accreditation process. Kayla, you mentioned a lot of the importance of campus racial climate. I'm wondering if either of you may want to say more about the role of accreditors in this area, and if there are additional thoughts or recommendations on this front.
Yeah, this is always interesting. So I always like to, when folk include when I'm introduced, like, she sat on the board at Fisk, and even though that was a long time ago, that was my first introduction to accreditation and accountability and a number of other topics in higher education, because we were undergoing SACS review. We had a lawsuit from the state of Tennessee because SACS had said you don't have enough money. So we were trying to sell art. Legally, we weren't supposed to. It became this just eye-opening experience to the sausage making of running an institution, for sure. But what I knew was, as a student, before I got there and when I got there, how it felt for me to perceive this very white organization coming in telling us what to do. That was my perception at 1920, along with my friends, and understanding, like, what's going on? I know what my faculty are doing well. I know how I feel on this campus. I know how empowered I am. I know when I go intern, when I am out in the field, whatever that means, I feel competitive. I'm just as prepared. I'm just as brilliant. What I did not understand was the disconnect between accrediting agencies and what they were looking for, because what they were looking for and what they were willing to shut our institution down over was dollars and cents, and not what was actually happening on campus. And so I think, in as much as we are saying some of these institutions might need technical support around issues of racial equity, we can own that accreditors may not have the expertise to be evaluating this. But I do think there are folks who mentioned Sean Harper, Dr. Estella Ben-Simone, like there are a number of people who are experts in evaluating equity, campus racial climate, sense of belonging, all these nice fancy things that we talk about in academic spaces, that need to make a better transition into policy and practice. I think it's possible. I think it's possible for accreditors to do that. I think we might need to do a bit more pushing the narrative around why it's necessary.
I'll just jump in really quickly, because when you think about the triad, state authorizing agencies really don't have the capacity to do that kind of work, or to really do, truthfully, a significant review. And I was in Pennsylvania, I oversaw the state authorizing office, and we had 3 people in that office. And so if you think that 3 people could do, a substantial or even, a good review, we are depending upon the federal government and the accreditors' kind of seal of success that this is an institution that will well serve the residents of the state. And so, I think that accreditors do have a role to play in in terms of campus racial climate. We did see a federal bill last year that was actually requiring institutions to have to conduct racial climate studies, and I think it could easily be incorporated as a substantial change to what accreditors look for in future reviews of campuses.
Very good. Thank you both. I think I saw come to my attention. Dr. Thompson, Danny Thompson had a question. Good to see you. And take it away.
Likewise. A question for you, Dr. Elliott. Specific to your third point that you mentioned in your presentation there toward the end. So I currently work for the U.S. Department of Education, Federal Student Aid. With that agency, as you know, a lot of what you've already been mentioned about accreditation, that's something we view very highly. It's tied to federal funding, Title IV funding specifically. We actually have a program called Project Success, where we're doing some of those technical assistance oriented things that you had mentioned, as well as we have an actual team dedicated to minority serving and under-resourced schools. That's everything from tribal institutions to predominantly Hispanic institutions to HBCUs. And we're starting to create a focus more so on community colleges. So that's an effort as well. But to your point, that piece and trying to focus on seeing how we can improve racial equity and things of that nature, I totally agree that that's an area where federal intervention, and I think one of the colleagues on the line, I think it was Will, mentioned it. That's something that we're focused on that needs to be raised. And maybe during this next administration, that's something that can happen. And I actually have a few colleagues that I can share some of the information that you provided. And I would definitely love to speak with you offline. And I don't know if your presentation will be made available to the group, but that'd be great as well.
Yeah, we can definitely share this with you all. And once the hard truth report is out, but once our OBF report is out, we'll be sure to send that. But yeah, sure. My email, I'll drop my email in the chat. And yeah, we'd love to learn more.
Thank you.
You know, I will say, since we're talking to folks at UGA, a lot of what happens, especially during the first 2 years of this administration, is going to be dependent upon what happens in Georgia in the next month. You know, if we don't see one or both of those seats flip to Democrats, and then I would argue that the Biden agenda over the first 2 years is largely going to be regulatory and executive action. And we won't see a ton of legislative, progressive legislative work coming out of this administration unless there is a majority in the Senate, Democratic majority in the Senate. And so, you know, I would say, Georgia matters, especially now, if you're hoping to see a progressive legislative agenda be advanced in the next 2 years.
Georgia is on a lot of people's minds these days, I know. And so, yeah, thank you for that that reminder and showing its relevance to this topic in particular, right? You mentioned reauthorization, for example, and other policy objectives. We had a question from John Foucault. Dr. Foucault raised a few questions in the chat that I'll raise now. One is a question about the political dynamics that exist that varies in some states. You know, any recommendations that you would have in engaging or advancing these recommendations in state contexts that may not, legislators or funding agencies may not buy into critical race theory or to other perspectives. You know, if you have any comments on how best to do that, and then another comment Dr. Foucault raises is, you know, here Georgia State University has gotten a lot of attention for their efforts to advance student success, particularly among students of color, and you know, that may be another way to move forward at the campus level on that front. So first one about state context. You know, what do you, how does Ed Trust recommend or work with such a wide variety of state perspectives on these recommendations?
I'll start and then kick it to Will. I think it's so interesting to see critical race theory like talked about in these ways and in like policy conversations and from the White House, right? I don't need you to believe it. I need you to understand what's happening in your state, right? I need you to understand data. I need you to look at your attainment goals. I need you to look at your attainment levels. I need you to understand the students that you and families that you are serving in your district and in this state. I need you to understand the workforce demands of your state. All of these things that are integral to your role as a policymaker demand of you to focus on racial equity, right? Like I don't know that I want to have discussions on critical race theory with state legislators. I want to talk about the access rate of students of color in your state. I want to talk about support for undocumented students. I want to talk about things that are in your power to change and do. And I want to talk about design and implementation of policies. I think that for me is just grounding the discussion in data, grounding discussions in reality, and what is best for students and families in that state has to be central. Like that is, I think that is the meeting point and the place where we agree. Like we are talking about increasing success. We are talking about increasing outcomes, and outcomes means lived reality. Outcomes means families who are now able to afford healthcare, families who can afford to own a home, families who are like, we're talking about income quintiles. We're talking about people who are getting out of poverty. Like there are ways that we have this discussion in spaces like this that have to be translated away from critical race theory, away from income quintiles, away from even attainment and into graduation rates. Enrollment, like into very specific. That was for sure when I left my PhD program and transitioned into this role. What I had to learn to do was be a bit more succinct, but also a bit more direct, and leave some of that behind. I think that is the approach. I will also, and this is like answering the question, but for the current students who are like, I might be thinking about policy and advocacy. The difference, I think, in doing research in this space, research and advocacy in this space, and research and advocacy from an academic space is the number. So when my content leaves me, it also goes to a communications team that knows how to massage out some of my academic language, and it goes to our partnerships and engagement team who understand the lay of the land and the ground, and do some of that tilling of the ground, who know local advocates in the states that we're working with, who can say, well, we have partners in Illinois at IBHE who will really take well to this. So how do we identify and do some of that power mapping and understanding that putting the information out there is not enough, saying it in a way where folks can agree, saying it in a way where they understand the reality for the people in their state and what that means for their ability to get reelected, because we understand that as a primary motivation, and going from there.
You know, I'll just say quickly, Eric, these conversations aren't easy anywhere. Kayla recently did a presentation to the Illinois Board of Higher Ed, and you would think that Illinois is a fairly progressive state, and the same, questions and, I would say comments that we get about, Black students or Latino students, we get them in Illinois. California recently defeated Prop 16. You can call California, California calls itself one of the most progressive states in the United States, and still they don't vote in favor of using race as a factor in admissions or hiring. And so, I would say these questions are difficult everywhere. Not only in blue states. We always start with the data. What are the disparities we see in the data? And if you can make that data more, I would say granularized to that state, not national data, but state data, or if you can get it down to the voting block area, I think that folks react better to that. And the second thing I would say is, you have to have a strategy. I used to talk to, grad students, and they were like, how can I get, decision makers to read, this piece I wrote? And, I would say, first you have to know who the decision makers are. Who are the folks on the State Department, the Congress level or the representative level in your state? Who's on the House Ed Committee, or who's on the Senate Ed Committee? Who are the head staffers? Who are your leading advocates in the state? we think about strategy when we're putting out a piece. So for example, the OBF piece, we have a meeting with our communications, with our partnerships and engagement. We think about where are the press pieces we need to get placed, and who do we need talking about it. So we preview our stuff with reporters. We tell them what the key messages are. We'll do interviews with them on background. We'll preview it to key state advocates. When we released our Segregation Forever piece, we talked to 106 advocates in California in advance of release of the report, so that they could all have this data and know that they could amplify it. How can they amplify it? How could they get the message out? And so, I would say the way you get folks to think about race is when you share their data, and then you create pressure, external pressure, by engaging advocates. And, I would say that that's very different than strategy that, I've had previously in previous roles. But as an advocate, we think about how do we create pressure on those folks who are making decisions to do the right things. There's a famous statement: Americans always do the right thing when all other options have been exhausted. And so, if we can eliminate the other options, we know folks will do the right thing.
Very good. Thank you both for those thoughtful responses. And it addresses one of the questions that I had about sharing more about the role that EdTrust plays in advocating for these policies. So thank you for sharing more about that. We have another question from a current student, Chad Mandela. Chad?
Hi, y'all. My name's Chad, and I use he, him pronouns, and I'm a second-year PhD student. And so I appreciate the way that you all sort of contextualize taking that data and trying to frame it in a way that's sort of as big tent as possible to really make it as usable. How, from a critical quantitative methodology perspective, do you also not then participate in erasing the identities of folks within those narratives, right? So how do you still maintain an intersectional conversation so that Black trans femmes aren't erased as we talk about the aggregate of Blackness and that experience within a state context? So how do you still maintain those layers of identity that are important for talking about those experiences without homogenizing it for the sake of creating buy-in?
I think that's a challenge, and I would say that's overwhelmingly a challenge in this work. A lot of times what we do, we'll start with the data, but I think collecting the student stories so that you're not trying to, make the experience a universal experience is critical. I'll give you an example, some work we're working on now, and it's on student parents, right? And so we're actually going to be calculating what I'm calling the true cost of education. And so as we're pulling this data and gathering this data, we're also going to be, there's a qualitative piece of this research where we're talking to student parents to capture their stories and their unique experience to help inform the work we're doing, and also to help inform our recommendations. We believe that we shouldn't be, Kim Hunter used to say this, no conversation about us without us. And so we do try to engage those who are directly impacted in the recommendations that we make in terms of policy. And so I think that the qualitative piece is a critical piece of that work. Another example of that in our work is we're doing some work on the National Black Student Debt Study. We did 1,000. We collected over 1,000 surveys from Black borrowers, but we also did over 100 qualitative interviews. And so we're trying to capture not only the quantitative data that provides us this big picture of Black borrowers, but also we're trying to capture the individual stories that tell us the narratives that people might be experiencing and the places where intersectionality might impact that experience, whether it be borrowing or as a student parent.
I think it's difficult when it comes to data set, quantitative data sets, because you mentioned Black trans films. I don't know any states that are collecting gender identities, right? So that we are limited for sure in understanding inequities and disparities if we can't even ask the question, right? So I think that's an important question. And if states that are trying to get that there, but I do think we are also limited by federal data and how that's collected. So for sure, there are things that we cannot begin to address with certain data sets. So I love that Will has pointed out something, but like the importance and value of qualitative research and methods and data. I do think like we had this entire discussion, I've been saying students of color, right? That's why I included that table, because we understand that experiences, disparities, and equities are not the same for Black students, Native students, Indigenous students, Latino students, students who identify across those identities, and that for sure we are limited, but we do our best to elevate, and like you said, in a big tent way to push the conversation forward, and then to drill down where necessary.
I think it's a good point, though, that that's maybe a recommendation from a policy perspective to collect that intersectional data. We recently released a report on professional judgment for financial aid counselors, and they don't collect any of that data by race, ethnicity. You could also collect it by gender identity or other fields, and that could be, I would say, an advance in policymaking and data and our understanding of some of the ways that people are experiencing these policies.
Thank you so much. I've got a list of questions here, and this has been a really our time is close. If you don't mind, there's one question in the chat. If you don't mind to answer, maybe give a brief response. One of our advisors in the Georgia College Advising Program, Bradford Porter, this is a program that works directly with high school students, encouraging them to enroll. Was really interested in the enrollment information reported on Black and diverse students and the decline of students who are enrolling, and wants to know if you have any suggestions or advice for encouraging diverse students to still consider college despite this decline and the ongoing pandemic. I know it's a huge, there's multiple dissertations on this, but I do think it's another question that focuses more directly at the student level. So if you had any brief thoughts, I thought that'd be a good way to close.
Well, a couple thoughts from me. One, if we're thinking specifically about the Georgia context, I think that we need to look at state policies that are encouraging students to explore post-secondary opportunities. So we could invest in high school counseling, right? Investing in high school guidance counseling, decreasing the number of students to counselors is an effective way to do that. We've seen states have dramatic increases in enrollment and college going who've made FAFSA high school graduation requirement. Georgia could implement a high school graduation requirement that requires students to complete the FAFSA or some other form, especially for those who are undocumented. If Georgia really wanted to do something to encourage or increase the number of Black students or low-income students, they would change their current state financial aid program from merit to need-based, make that 100% need-based scholarship, and that would impact the post-secondary. And the reason I think that we see decreases is because it increases the lack of affordability for students. So if you were to implement a FAFSA as a high school graduation requirement, students who may qualify for Pell Grant would know that. If you would be informing students from the get-go that they were eligible for Georgia merit-based scholarship, that would have a huge impact. And then, I would say the last thing that could be done from a statewide perspective is, I think Idaho has done it, is that they have all of the data and automatically admit students to state public institutions based on their GPA and their test scores, right? They are doing it even if the students don't apply. So everyone, if you make the eligibility requirement, they send you a note, say, hey, you've been admitted to these colleges. It's increased college going and access. Those are, I'd say 4 things that could be done in Georgia to improve access for low-income students and Black students specifically. We also should be targeting resources. We know K-12 schools are more segregated now than they were, ever. And so we should be targeting resources at those institutions where we know there are a significant number of Black students and they may not be getting the resources, the access, the information that they need that helps students to make decisions. And I don't know if Kayla wants to add anything.
I think that's perfect.
Okay. Will and Kayla, I can't thank you enough. This has been a wonderful event. You've you brought down the house. We're got a great response here in the last week before we end this this term and this year. And we really appreciate you making time to be with us today and to share such compelling information. So thank you for joining us. Thank you all for being here. And as Charles mentioned, we'll be back in this Zoom format in February for our third event in the Critical Perspectives on Race series. We're all looking forward to Dr. Eddie Cole's presentation. Thank you so much, Will and Kayla.
All right, thank you all.